Om Sarashavasamaramabham Shankaracharya Madhyamam Asmaracharya Pariyantam Vande Guru Paramparam. Om. Good. Be seated, please. Parameshvara. Om. Good. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahana Bhunaktu Sahaviryan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Good. Nice to see you all this morning as we continue our study of Chapter 10. Welcome also to all of the students who attend these classes online. We'll begin today with reciting several verses, beginning with verse 23. And as always, as I'm chanting, be sure to read the translation and then repeat after me. 23, yes. Rudranam Shankaraschasmi, Rudranam Shankaraschasmi, Vittesho Yaksha Rakshasam, Vittesho Yaksha Rakshasam, Vasunam Pavakaschasmi, Vasunam Pavakaschasmi, Meru Shikari Namaham, Meru Shikari Namaham, Purodhasam cha mukhyam mam, Purodhasam cha mukhyam. Excuse me. Vidhi partha brahaspatim, Vidhi partha brahaspatim, Senani namaham skandaha, Senani namaham skandaha, Sarasamasmi sagaraha, Sarasamasmi sagaraha, Maharshinam bhriguraham, Maharshinam bhriguraham, Giramasmyekam aksharam, Giramasmyekam aksharam, Yajnanam japa yajñosmi, Yajnanam japa yajñosmi, Stavaranam Himalayaha, Stavaranam Himalayaha, Ashvatha sarva vrikshanam, Ashvatha sarva vrikshanam, Devarshinam cha naradaha, Devarshinam cha naradaha, Gandharvanam chitrarataha, Gandharvanam chitrarataha, Siddhanam kapilo munihi, Siddhanam kapilo, Uchaishravassamashvanam, Uchaishravassamashvanam, Vidhi mam amritodbhavam, Vidhi mam amritodbhavam, Airavatam gajendranam, Airavatam gajendranam, Naranam cha naradhipam, Naranam cha naradhipam, Ayudhanamaham vajram, Ayudhanamaham vajram, Dhenu namasmi kamadhuka, Dhenu namasmi kamadhuka, Prajanaschasmi kandarpaha, Prajanaschasmi Kandarpaha Sarpanamasmi Vasukihi Sarpanamasmi Vasukihi Anantaschasmi Naghanam Anantaschasmi Naghanam Varuno Yarasamaham Varuno Yarasam Pitranam Haryama Chasmi Pitranam Haryama Chasmi Yama Samyamatamaham Yama Samyamatamaham. Very good. And we finished verse 24. We continue with verse 25. Remember in the last class we had started this wonderful section of chapter 10, one of the most poetic and I think uplifting portions of the entire Bhagavad Gita, in which Sri Krishna speaks as Ishvara and says, I am to put it in very simple words, I am the greatest of the great. Remember the context. Here Sri Krishna, throughout the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna teaches that the more you know who and what Ishvara is, the more your bhakti, your devotion will arise, more powerful your prayer life will become, because who is it, after all, that we pray to and worship? So that knowledge of Ishvara is crucial. There are many ways to convey that knowledge of Ishvara. Starting in chapters 7 and 9, he used some very profound philosophical teachings that we summarized with the dream metaphor. I won't talk about it now, we may come back to it today. But that dream metaphor, just as you are the creator of your dream world, Ishvara is the creator of the cosmos. This is a very simple way to understand some very profound teachings about who and what is Ishvara. But in addition to that philosophical approach, there is a way that's based on our own experience. This is a nice way to introduce this section. When we experience something amazing, it elevates our minds. And the best example I can give is years ago traveling in the Himalayas and seeing those majestic mountains. It just lifts your spirits, elevates your mind, and allows you a little glimpse of the glories of Ishvara. And that's the title of this chapter. Vibhuti Yoga. Vibhuti can be translated as glories. Through experiencing the glories of the world, including the glories of nature, we have an opportunity to see Ishvara's manifestations in the highest of the high, the lowest of the low, the greatest of the great. And as I mentioned in the last class, it's like science. By looking out into the most distant reaches, and by looking down at the other extreme, inside of atoms and particles, by examining the extremes, the extreme vastness of the cosmos and the extreme smallness of the subatomic world, by examining the extremes, science comes to learn something more profound about the physical world. Here, Sri Krishna says, by examining the extremes of creation, we come to understand something more of the creator of Ishvara. So, with that introduction, we'll continue. And this section is rather lengthy, and the verses are fairly simple, so we'll move, like we did in the last class, we'll move fairly quickly through these verses. We'll pick up the thread with verse 25. Maharshinam bhriguraham, Maharshinam bhriguraham, Giramasmyekam aksharam, Giramasmyekam aksharam, Yajnanam japa yajñosmi, Yajnanam japa yajñosmi, Stavaranam Himalayah, Stavaranam Himalayah. And the last line is a metaphor I just gave in the mountains. We'll see that in just a moment. Maharshi Nam, among all the great rishis, among all the great rishis, Sri Krishna says, Aham, I am the greatest of those rishis. Remember, Sri Krishna here, when he says Aham, he's not referring to himself as Arjuna's charioteer or even as an avatar of Lord Vishnu. He's referring to himself here as Ishvara, God of the cosmos. He says, among all the great rishis, Aham, I am the greatest of the rishis, who, according to Sri Krishna anyway, the greatest of the rishis is Bhrigu. Bhrigu is one of the Sapta Rishi, the 7 rishis. Bhrigu is one of the mind-born sons of Brahmaji. And you could debate whether or not Bhrigu is the greatest, but no doubt Bhrigu was a great, great rishi, head of the Bhargava lineage, which continues even to this day. So Sri Krishna gives Bhrigu as an example of the greatest of the great. And to paraphrase, Sri Krishna says, among all the great rishis, I am the one manifest in the form of Bhrigu, the greatest of those rishis. He continues, Giram. Gira is an unusual word for shabda, for word. So Giram, among all words, what is the most important word, of course in the Sanskrit language, not in English or Hindi, the most important word, I think you'd agree, Om. He says, Giram, among all words, asmi, you have to break apart the words, I am, ekam aksharam. I am the ekam, one aksharam syllable. And this is a little poetic way. Ekam aksharam refers not to any one syllable, but to the one syllable, Om. The one syllable with which the Vedas begin and end, the one syllable with which all of our prayers begin and end. Why that one syllable Om? Sri Krishna says, among all syllables, I am the syllable Om. Om is special for several reasons. I'll give just 2 of them. We could spend the rest of the class talking about Om. So 2 primary reasons Om is considered the greatest of syllables here. One is Om is a sound symbol for Ishvara. We have different kinds of symbolic representations of Ishvara. For example, on our altar are several forms or images. We call them pratima. Pratima is a symbolic representation of Ishvara in a physical form. So pratima is a physical form, but there are other kinds of symbols. In addition to pratima, there are other symbols called pratika. Pratika is a form which is more abstract, like a sound. So just as a physical form can symbolize or represent Ishvara, in the same way a sound can represent Ishvara. So Om is a pratika, a sound symbol for Ishvara. But more than that, Om itself, of why is Om selected as the best sound symbol for Ishvara? Om, as you may have heard me teach long ago when we discussed this at length, Om is a sound that includes all other sounds. And here's how. There's a very easy way to understand why Om is so important. It's an all-inclusive sound. Your vocal apparatus begins down here in your diaphragm and continues up through your chest, up through your throat, your larynx, your mouth, your tongue, and the outermost part of your vocal apparatus is your lips. So between your diaphragm and lips, all sounds are produced. When you chant Om, Om, the sound begins with your diaphragm. Om, and when you end, the sound Om ends at the tip of your lips. So Om is a sound that begins at your diaphragm, ends at your lips, thereby encompassing the entire range of sounds, the entire vocal production. So that's why Om, among all syllables, among all sounds, Sri Krishna says, I am Om, the most sacred of all sounds. Yajnanam, among all yajnas, rituals, sacrifice. In ancient times, the only ritual that was practiced really was yajna. Puja, as we practice today, wasn't practiced back in ancient times. So yajnanam, among all sacrifices, among all rituals, which is the best ritual? He says, japa yajnaha asmi. Asmi, I am the yajna, the ritual, the sacrifice called japa. Japa, as most of you know, is recitation of a mantra. You don't think of mantra as being a sacrifice, but you need to see the metaphorical connection. When you do a yajna, we call homam or havan, you make offerings into that sacrificial fire, one after another, often ghee, other things as well. So you offer ghee again and again. Swaha, Om Agnav, Om Hagnaye Swaha, Om Indraya Swaha. So one after another, you make all of these oblations, are called, into that sacrificial fire. How many? Well, it depends on the ritual. Sometimes maybe 108. Sometimes, if more elaborate, 1,008. Sometimes just 3, depending on the ritual. But it's a finite number. You have, it goes on and then the ritual is over. In japa, first of all, japa is considered a sacrifice because just because you offer ghee into the sacrificial fire. Here in japa, you're offering your mind, and if you're doing it out loud, your voice. Certainly your mind, and sometimes your voice, is offered unto Ishvara by uttering a sacred mantra, like Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namo Narayanaya. And each utterance of the mantra is an offering, like an oblation into the fire. So you can offer ghee, Om Shivaya Swaha, this oblation unto Shiva, or you can make an oblation with your mind and voice, Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya. And each oblation into the fire is equivalent to each oblation you make by uttering Om Namah Shivaya. You can make oblations into the fire 108 times, 1,008 times. How many times can you chant Om Namah Shivaya in a day? Just letting it go in the back of your mind. Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya. You can do that. That's not hard. You call it japa nishtha, when you've chanted your mantra so often that it becomes like the soundtrack that's in your mind, in the background, playing all the time, so that whenever your mind is unoccupied, what arises in your mind, let me just be a little sarcastic here. When your mind is unoccupied, where does it usually go? All kinds of nonsense our mind will go after. But when you are deeply ingrained in this practice of mantra japa, repetition of the mantra, when your mind is not otherwise occupied, what will arise in your mind is your mantra, Om Namah Shivaya. And that can occur thousands and thousands of times each day. Whenever your mind is unoccupied, Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya. For this reason, Sri Krishna says, among all rituals, among all sacrifices, the best of those rituals, I am. And what is that ritual? The ritual repetition of a mantra. Stavaranam, among all things that don't move, Himalayaha, I am the Himalayas, the great mountains. From space, there aren't many objects visible on the Earth. Of course, from far space, if you're in near orbit, you can make out things. You can even make out cities and things. But if you're as far away from the Earth as like the sun is some 93 million miles away. Earth is going to be very small, or even from the distance of the moon. Or we've seen pictures, Earth from the moon. You've seen pictures of that. You can't make out cities. You can't make out national boundaries. You can't tell where the United States ends and Canada and Mexico begins. But you can make out oceans, you can make out continents, you can make out. On those continents, you can make out mountain ranges. And the Himalayas are the largest mountain range. From the moon, you can make out the Himalayas. So he says, among all things that don't move, I am the mighty Himalayas. Also, there's a sanctity associated with the Himalayas for a specific reason. This is all symbolism, so allow me to share with you a little bit more of the symbolism. Symbolism, I think, can enrich your experience of this tradition and help it become more meaningful for you. So in the tradition, Hindu tradition in general, north is considered the auspicious direction, the most auspicious direction. East to a lesser degree, but north, the most auspicious direction. South, the least auspicious direction. South being associated with Yama, god of death. North being associated with moksha. And this is a symbolic association. There's probably some profound reasoning for it. I'm not sure exactly what it is. North symbolically represents moksha. It's the direction of Mount Meru up in the Himalayas, the northernmost point of the universe in ancient mythology. That north representing moksha, you can see why the Himalayas are to the north. For all of South Asia, the Himalayas are in the north. Further, the river Ganga, we're going to see a reference to the river Ganga later, flows from north to south and east. I know it goes out to the Bay of Bengal. But anyway, it flows south from the Himalayas before it turns east. So that flow of the Himalayas, the flow of the Ganga from the Himalayas then represents the flow of sacred wisdom from the ancient rishis to modern times. Lots of nice symbolism in all that. We'll see a reference to the Ganga here shortly. Okay, that was Himalaya. Next. Ashwatha sarva vrikshanam, Ashwatha sarva vrikshanam, Devarshinan cha naradaha, Devarshinan cha naradaha, Gandharvanam chitrarataha, Gandharvanam chitrarataha, Siddhanam kapilo munihi, Siddhanam kapilo munihi. Sarva vrikshanam, vriksha tree, sarva all. Amongst all trees, all varieties, all species of trees, Sri Krishna says, I am the Ashwatha, the sacred people tree. It's a tree that just as symbolically north is associated with moksha, this tree, the sacred people tree, is associated with sanctity, holiness, associated with Ishvara ultimately. We're going to see a big reference to this Ashwatha tree in chapter 15, but for now we'll just say amongst all trees there's one species called sacred. That species is called in Sanskrit Ashwatha. Devarshinam. Deva, Rishi, Devarshi, the one who's both a rishi and a god, a divine rishi. Amongst all divine rishis, Sri Krishna says, I am Narada. Narada is such a famous figure in all the Puranic stories, often a troublemaker, but by most certainly the most famous of all those Devarshis, most famous even of the rishis, is Narada. He says, amongst all those rishis, divine rishis, I am Narada. Gandharvanam. There are various classes of deity. There are yakshas and Gandharvas and all of these. So Gandharva is a class of celestial beings. And even within the Gandharvas, there are different categories. So there are categories of celestial beings. One category is Gandharva. And then within the category of Gandharvas, there are subcategories. There's a Manushya Gandharva and a Deva Gandharva. Well, the highest category, of which is called Deva Gandharva, this Chitraratha is one of those Deva Gandharvas, one of the highest in that category of celestial beings. And Chitraratha is famous for being, how can we say, if you imagine the heavens as being like some celestial city, there is one particular musician who is most famous in the celestial world. The most famous of all the musicians in the celestial world is called Chitraratha. It's like the most famous musician in India, I don't know, there's Lata Mangeshkar, passed away some time ago, sadly. Or how about in American culture? Who would you choose? How about some people would choose Elvis Presley. So the most famous musician. So for the gods, amongst all the gods in heaven, the most famous musician was not Elvis. The most famous musician was Chitraratha. Siddhanam, amongst all those who have gained perfection, perfected beings, divine beings, saintly beings, enlightened beings. Amongst all those perfected, enlightened beings, Krishna says, I am Kapilaha Munihi. I am the Muni, I am the Rishi, the sage, whose name was Kapila. There are actually many Kapilas. This would be be the first of the many Kapilas, a sage called Kapila. I am that Kapila, that perfected Rishi, sage. He continues. More reference to the Puranic scriptures. Uchchaishravasama Uchchaishravasama Vidhi mam amritodbhavam Vidhi mam amritodbhavam Airavatam Gajendranam Airavatam Gajendranam Naranam cha naradhipam Naranam cha naradhipam. References here to Bhagavata Purana and other Puranas as well. And I'll remind you, I am not an expert in Puranic literature. It's extensive and full of these complicated stories. I'll remind you that the stories in all these Puranas are different. I think that's important to know. The same story can be retold in different Puranas in different ways. So you get the story about Shiva doing one thing in one Purana, a story about Shiva doing the same thing in another Purana, and the stories have many details that are different. That should tell us something. The fact that the stories are different in different Puranas tells us these are not historical stories. Now, Purana means old or ancient, and some people will take the Puranas then as collection of ancient history. These are not historical stories. They are ahistorical stories. You've heard me say this before. When the gods and devas got into a big fight, that big battle between the devas and asuras, you've heard me make facetious statements. Did it take place on a Wednesday morning or a Thursday afternoon? And you get the point I'm making, and that is, these are not events situated in human history. If you choose to call them mythological, I don't see any harm in that. Some people are offended by the term mythology. Oh, that's okay. Mythology doesn't mean silly or factitious. In fact, the stories of the Puranas, even though they may not be historically situated in the history of mankind, they are full of important spiritual teachings. That's what makes them important, is their spiritual content, their symbolism. What makes the Puranas important is not their historicity. What makes them important is the symbolism and spiritual teachings. So, amongst all of those stories, there's a famous story about the Devas and Asuras who wanted Amrita, the nectar of immortality. And most of you know the story well. What did they do to get this nectar of immortality? They had to churn the milky ocean. You've heard this story probably from childhood on. How did they churn the milky ocean? It's all ocean. Not like you're churning butter in a pot. So to churn the ocean, they used an entire mountain, Mandara, as the churning rod. And they used this giant celestial snake called Vasuki as a rope. They wrapped Vasuki around the mountain, and the Devas pulled on one side, Asuras pulled on another, and they churned the milky ocean in search of Amrita, which eventually bubbled out of the milky ocean. But before the Amrita emerged, many, many other things emerged, including the celestial horses. And that's the first reference here. Ashwanam. Amongst all horses, Sri Krishna says, Uchaishravasam. I am the greatest horse, the horse known as Uchaishravasa, was the celestial horse, the greatest of the horses, Uchaishravas. And Vidhi Mam, understand that I am that celestial horse which emerged from the milky ocean, Amrita Udbhavam, born from Amrita. Here Amrita means that milky ocean, born from the sea. So a reference to that famous story. Also, not only this horse, Uchaishravas, came also the great celestial elephants also emerged, including the greatest of those elements called Airavata. Gajendranam, Gaja, Indra, here Indra means greatest. Gaja, you may know as elephant. Amongst all the greatest elephants, I am Airavata, the celestial celestial elephant that emerged during the churning of the milky ocean. And finally in this verse, Sri Krishna says, Naranam. Amongst all people, I am Nara Adhipa, the king of men. Among all men, I am king. Now, king is a political leader, and in modern times, political leaders are not looked upon in a very high way. The political leader of Great Britain just got kicked out because he lied, and he wasn't a very straightforward person. Other issues as well, I'm sure, politics being what it was. But it's important here to understand the concept of king in ancient times. And the king was a political leader, no doubt, but it's significant that most of the Sanskrit words for king include the word pa or palaka, words that mean protector. In ancient times, the king was considered the protector of men. That was that. So, and here, adhipa, nara adhipa, literally means the protector of all people. That's the original role of king. So the one who protects all the people of the kingdom, that one person is the king. He protects all. So that is certainly the greatest person of the kingdom is the one who protects all. So therefore Sri Krishna says, among all people, I am Nara Adhipam, I am the king, I am the protector of all people. Then, Ayudhanamaham Vajram, Ayudhanamaham Vajram, Dhenu namasmi Kamaduka, Dhenu namasmi Kamaduka, Prajanaschasmi Kandarpaha, Prajanaschasmi Kandarpaha, Sarpanamasmi Vasukihi, Sarpanamasmi Vasukihi. Ayudhanam, amongst all weapons. So not just the greatest of the great, the worst of the worst, the most fearful weapon. In modern times, the most fearful weapon we know of is the thermonuclear hydrogen bomb. A single bomb, which is about maybe, maybe about 3-4 meters long, that single bomb could flatten most of Manhattan. Think about it. A single bomb could flatten most of Manhattan. It's mind-boggling, the terrible, destructive power of that bomb. Of course, speaking of destructive power, who can destroy the entire cosmos at the end of time when the universe undergoes pralaya and enters a state of dissolution? Ishvara is the one who can figuratively destroy, not just Manhattan, the entire cosmos. But here, the reference is to Ayudha, a particular weapon. And in the Puranas, there are stories of Indra, king of the gods, who wielded his mighty weapon, which is kind of known as like a thunderbolt. But really speaking, that weapon was not, it's called, Vajram is we translate as thunderbolt, but Indra's weapon was actually the bone of a great sage, Dadichi. And I think Dadichi was the descendant of the Rishi Bhrigu. There's all these connections between all these characters. And there's some obscure story. I didn't look up the story. You can, if you want, you can go and find out why it is that the bone of this great sage Dadichi becomes Indra's most powerful weapon. A little bit like, how can uranium and plutonium elements give rise to such terrible destructive force? You have to research that in the same way. How can this bone of this great sage become such a destructive, powerful weapon in the hands of Indra? You can find some story in the Puranas that explains that. I don't know the particular story. Tenunam asmi kamaduk. We're back to the milky ocean and the churning of it. Amongst all the beings and things to emerge from that was Kamaduk, the wish-fulfilling cow. This cow was, I think, the favorite cow of the Rishi Vasishta, and when you were in the presence of this cow, whoever owned that cow, their wishes would be magically fulfilled. So therefore, Dhenunam, amongst all cows, Asmi, I am Kamaduk. I am the wish-fulfilling cow that also emerged from the churning of the milky ocean. Prajanaha cha Asmi. Prajanaha, amongst all prajana, literally procreators. The procreators for mankind, the ones from whom we all descended. Amongst all procreators, Sri Krishna says, Asmi, I am. Kandarpa. Kandarpa is a name for what you might better know as Kamadeva. Kamadeva, the god of love, God of passion, which drives human beings to procreate. So I am Kamadeva among all procreators, and Sarpanam among all snakes, Asmi, I am Vasuki. Vasuki, of course, was the snake who was wound around the mountain, who was pulled upon head and tail by the Devas and Asuras to churn the milky ocean. So amongst all snakes, I am Vasuki. There are different categories of snakes. So there's one category of snake called Sarpa. There's another category of snake called Naga. So in the next verse, we get another reference to a different category of snakes. Anantaschasmi Naghanam. Oops. Chasmi Naghanam. Varuno Yara Samaham. Varuno Yara Samaham. Pitrnam Haryama Chasmi. Pitrnam Haryama Chasmi. Yama Samyamatamaham. Yama Samyamatamaham. So Sarpanam, prior verse, among all Sarpas, Sri Krishna says, I am Vasuki. Vasuki was the king of the celestial serpents. But there are other important serpents. And here the serpent species is called Naga. Naganam, amongst all those Naga serpents, Sri Krishna says, Asmi, I am Ananta. Ananta Shesha, or Adi Shesha, is the snake on which Lord Vishnu was lying on the bottom of that milky ocean. All these references, many references to the Bhagavata Purana in particular. So the snake on which Lord Vishnu was resting was named Ananta. Varunaha Yadasamasmi. Some of you know Varuna as the Vedic god of water. Yadasam, amongst all waters, amongst all bodies of waters, amongst all the oceans and rivers and seas, Sri Krishna says, Aham, I am Varuna, the god of waters, the god of the waters. Pitrnam, amongst all the ancestors. In ancient times, they understood a Pitraloka, a realm of the ancestors, a celestial realm of the ancestors, and every one of these realms had its king, as Indra was king of Devaloka. In the same way, there was a Pitraloka, a realm of ancestors, and who is the king of Pitraloka? His name was Aryama. So amongst all the ancestors, Sri Krishna says, I am Aryama, the king of all the ancestors, the king of Pitraloka. And finally in this verse, Samyamatam. Samyama. Yama, most of you know as the god of death, and you will see why in just a moment. But the root, the Sanskrit root, yama, means to restrain, to control. Samyama is to be completely in control. Samyamatam. Amongst those who are completely in control, you can guess where this is going. Sri Krishna says, Aham, I am Yama, god of death. You think you're in control of your life? The point is very clear. The one who is finally in control of our lives is let's be very clear. The one who is finally now you have some control, you have control over your health. And if you fail to take responsibility for your health, you can be sure Yama is going to come knocking on your door sooner rather than later. So you better take care of your health. But the one who is ultimately not in charge of your life is not your doctor, your family physician, or your cardiologist. The one who is finally in control is Yama. All right. Then, Prahladaschasmi daityanam, Prahladaschasmi daityanam, Kala kalayatamaham, Kala kalayatamaham, Mriganam chamrigendroham, Mriganam chamrigendroham, Vainateyascha pakshinam, Vainateyascha pakshinam, Daityanam. Daitya. Daitya is a class of actually it's a category, it's a family of Rakshasas. If you think your family has problems. So there's the descendants of a goddess known as Diti. So her progeny, the progeny of Diti are known as Daitya, and it was a ancestry of Rakshasas. So Daityanam, in that family of Rakshasas, Sri Krishna says, I am the greatest of those Rakshasas. And the greatest of a Rakshasa was a young, rebellious Rakshasa, many of you know from another famous story in Bhagavata Purana, the famous story of Prahlada. Prahlada was the son of Hiranyakashipu, who was a terrible Rakshasa king. And this Prahlada, his son, rejected his father's demonic ways and was highly devoted to Lord Vishnu. Wonderful stories about Prahlada in the Puranas. And a nice story, too, that show that Prahlada, in spite of his demonic ancestry, he was able to rise above all that and be deeply devoted to Lord Vishnu. Very powerful symbolic statement there. Kalaha kalayatamaham. Kalana is counting. Kalayata, things that count. Like computers. Computers are literally counting machines. So kalayatam, amongst all devices and things and people that count, Sri Krishna says, aham, I am, kalaha, time. Time, there's an English expression. Time is the measure of all things. I think that's an expression. Time certainly measures our lifetimes, how many days and months and years we live. So amongst all measures, kalayata, I am time, the measure of life. Mriganam, and amongst all animals, I am the king of all animals, the king of the jungle. Mriga, Indra, the king of all mriga, of all animals. Aham, I am the king of all animals. I am the mighty lion. Vainateya hacha pakshinam. Pakshinam, among all birds. So prior verse was talking about animals that are on the, actually we get all categories. So first we get animals who are on the ground. Among all animals on the ground, he says, I am the lion. Among all birds, we see now, and later we're going to see among all fish, aquatic animals. We'll see in just a moment. Here, pakshinam, amongst all animals that fly, I am Vainateya, a name for Garuda. Garuda was Lord Vishnu's vehicle, the celestial bird, Garuda. I am Garuda amongst all beings that fly. Then he continues. Pavana pavatamasmi, pavana pavatamasmi, Rama shastra bhrutamaham, Rama shastra bhrutamaham, Jashanam makaraschasmi, Jashanam makaraschasmi, Srotasamasmi janhavi, Srotasamasmi janhavi. Pavatam. Pavata is that which is purifying. And in ancient culture, it's always said that which is most purifying is fire, Agni. So Pavatam, among all things that purify, Asmi, I am, and you would really expect Sri Krishna to say fire here, because fire is so central in ancient culture as the primary means of purification. So very surprisingly, Sri Krishna doesn't say, I am fire. He says, I am pavana, wind. That seems odd. Why wind? There are several reasons. First, wind can blow out a fire. Further, fire creates the smoke, and wind can blow away that smoke. Wind can blow away the ashes of a fire. So Sri Krishna says, amongst all who purify, I am wind, the one who is most purifying. Ramaha shastra bhritamaham. Shastra bhrit, one who holds a shastra, weapon, is shastra bhrit, warrior. Shastra Bhritam, amongst all those who bear weapons, amongst all warriors, Aham, I am the mightiest of all warriors, and no one would argue the mightiest of all warriors is Rama. Rama, the mightiest of all warriors, for defeating the mightiest of all enemies, Ravana. Ravana having 10 heads, 10 heads suggesting 10 powers, 10 times the intelligence, 10 times the strategy, 10 times. 10 times any other opponent is Ravana, and Rama was able to defeat Ravana, the greatest of all warriors. Jashanam, amongst all fish, all aquatic animals. So prior verse, we had animals on the ground, animals in the sky. Now we get animals in the waters, Jashanam, amongst all aquatic animals. Makarahacha, asmi, I am Makara, the crocodile, alligator. Eats other fish is the idea. Srotasam, amongst all, srotas is that which flows, water that flows, rivers. Amongst all the rivers, Asmi, I am. You know he's going to say Ganga, but he uses a word for Ganga, Janhavi. Janhavi is one of many names for the sacred Ganga river. And there's another obscure mythological story. There was a rishi called Janhu, and this rishi had his hut on the banks of the Ganga, and the Ganga overflowed, swept away his hut, and he got upset. So what did he do? He drank the entire Ganga. Gone. This is a story, right? So he drank the whole Ganga, and then there was no more Ganga. But the sage, the very elaborate stories, and this is a good example of another story that's told differently in different Puranas. So it's a story of the king Bhagirathi, who prayed to have the Ganga come down, but his story is told in different ways in different Puranas. In this case, I'm not sure which Purana this comes from. I am not an expert in these stories, but this particular story I know, and that is the Janhu got upset that Ganga swept away his hut. He drank the entire Ganga. Bhagirati, the king, wanted the Ganga to come down from the heavens to purify his dead ancestors. Long, complicated story. I'll spare you the details. But Bhagirati then prayed that Janhu should release the Ganga so it can continue to flow down from the Himalayas. And Janhu, the king, the rishi, complied. And according to the story, the river emerged from his ear. Very amazing, these stories. And for that reason, since the Ganga in the story emerges from the ear of Rishi Janhu, it is therefore called Janhavi, the one who comes from the Rishi Janhu. Then, Sagaran, Sarganam Harirantascha, Sarganam Harirantascha, Madhyam Chaivaham Arjuna, Madhyam Chaivaham Arjuna, Adhyatma Vidya Vidyanam, Adhyatma Vidya Vidyanam, Vara Pravadatamaham, Vara Pravadatamaham. Sarganam, for all creation, for all that exists, Sri Krishna says in the second line at the end, Aham, I, Arjuna, O Arjuna, Sarganam, I am for all that exists, for all of creation, I am the Adihi, the beginning, drop down a line, Madhyam, middle, and back up a line, Antaha, end. I am the beginning, middle, and end. I am the creator, sustainer, destroyer. I am Brahma, Vishnu, Maheshwara, for all that exists. And this goes back to our wonderful dream metaphor. For your dream world, you are the Adi, the origin for your dream world. You are the Madhya, the one who sustains your dream world until you wake up. And then when you wake up, you are the Antaha. You bring about the end of that dream world. Very clear why that dream metaphor is so primary in our understanding of who and what is Ishvara. Notice then that the ancient rishis never envisioned God, to use the English word, as a deity in some loka, in some realm. So in Greek mythology, there are all these gods and all these heavenly worlds. And in Hindu mythology also, so many gods and so many worlds. In Middle Eastern theology, each tribe had its god. One of those gods, the gods of one of the tribes was named Yahweh. And that God had his own world. Our Father who art in heaven, the Christians who came later declared. But our Father who art in heaven, according to the ancient rishis, is a very limiting perspective. Heaven is a particular place. Father, not mother. Why not mother? So therefore, the vision of the ancient rishis was so much more vast than these other concepts of God. The beginning, middle, and end for all that exists. Then, Vidyanam in the third line. For all forms of knowledge, for all teachings. Which is the highest of all teachings, of all forms of knowledge? Knowledge of computers can give you a good job. Nowadays, you can make a lot of money programming computers. Knowledge of medicine can help you save lives. Wonderful. but all the medical knowledge and computer knowledge won't put an end to suffering. There is only one kind of wisdom or knowledge or teaching that can put an end to all human suffering. And that is Adhyatma Vidya. The Vidya, the wisdom or knowledge, which is Adhyatma, knowledge of Atma, knowledge of the true self, spiritual knowledge. Amongst all forms of teachings and knowledge, I am Adhyatma Vidya. And Pravadatam, amongst all modes of speech. Pravadatam, or amongst all who speak, can also mean amongst all who speak and amongst all who argue. And today that seems particularly relevant because there are a lot of arguments going on today in politics and in amongst what do they call it? They're calling it now in a very powerful expression. We live in a time of a culture war. Of course, every era of mankind has its own culture wars, but nowadays the culture wars we're seeing waged are particularly virulent culture wars, and people are arguing, they're shouting at the top of their lungs with their own particular points of view, and everyone is arguing to make their particular point. Notice they're not arguing about what is true, about what is real. They're arguing to support their position. This is often called rhetoric. Rhetoric is the use of language to support your position. It's not use of words in pursuit of wisdom, knowledge, truth. Rhetoric is a polite way of talking about propaganda, or to put a spin on something to make a point that may or may not be true, but it's designed to support your position. We see that so much nowadays. Lots of words spoken to support various points of view, as opposed to words that communicate truth. Words that communicate truth are called here vada. Vada, words that don't promote a particular position, words that convey truth. Amongst all forms of speech, including rhetoric and propaganda and what do they call it? Fake news, they call it nowadays. Amongst all of that, Sri Krishna says, I am Vada, words that convey truth. Then, Aksharanamakarosmi, Aksharanamakarosmi, Dvandva samasikasya cha, Dvandva samasikasya cha, Ahamevakshaya kalo, Ahamevakshaya kalo, Dhataham vishwato mukaha, Dhataham vishwato mukaha. Some references here to Sanskrit grammar. Aksharanam, amongst all, could be syllables, but here letters, akshara. Amongst all letters, Sri Krishna says, which letter of the alphabet, Sri Krishna says, asmi, I am. Amongst all the letters of the alphabet, I am akara, I'm the letter A. For several reasons. A comes first. Many of you, when you were learning language, you didn't learn A, B, C, D, E, F, G, as your children learn in this country. Many of you learned E, U. So the first letter is A. But in a more profound grammatical way, try this. Try to pronounce a consonant like T but without a vowel. Try to pronounce a consonant, maybe K, without a vowel. In order to pronounce K, you have to say ka. You have to put a vowel after it. And in Sanskrit, the vowel that is placed after every consonant to make it pronounceable is a. So ka is the letter K plus the letter a. The letter a allows the letter K to be pronounced. So therefore, the letter a is associated with all the consonants. It is an all-pervasive letter, as it were, so therefore very appropriate as symbolizing Ishvara. Then, another grammatical reference, samasikasya. In grammar, there's such a thing as a samasa, a compound word. For example, when you say Mahatma, it's two words put together. Maha plus Atma becomes a compound word, Mahatma. There are a half a dozen different kinds of compounds, 4 major kinds of compounds, and one of those kinds of compounds is called a dvandva. Dvandva is a compound when you put 2 words together, like Mata Pitarao, mother and father. And Sri Krishna says, amongst all compounds, I am the dvandva. Why the dvandva? There are several ways you could explain it, but one easy way is something unique about Sanskrit language is that it has a dual number. The compound I just made, Mata Pitarao, has a dual declension. We don't have just singular and plural in Sanskrit. In addition to singular and plural, there is a dual number. And that's something unique among Sanskrit. So maybe with that in mind, Sri Krishna says, amongst all compounds, I am the dvandva. Aham eva akshaya kalaha. And I am kala, time. We already had a reference to time, right? So time, which was the measure of all things, was mentioned several verses ago. And here kala comes again, but in a different context. So he says, aham eva, I indeed am kala, time, not as a measure of things. I am time, which is akshayaha, never ending. I am that which is eternal, unborn, uncreated. Please bear in mind that even in modern science, we understand that time was born. Time began with the Big Bang 13 billion years ago. This is not science, so we have to understand these references the way they understood. And the way they understood time as time being uncreated. We think time came into creation 13 billion years ago, scientifically correct, but in their worldview, time was never created. In fact, the universe comes and goes in time from their worldview. The cycle of creation and dissolution occurs in infinite time. That's how they understood time. So I am, Sri Krishna says, I am that never-ending flow of time in which universes are born and go away. We'll end with this verse, but just an interesting observation. It was such an amazing discovery that occurred maybe just before our lifetimes when they realized that the universe had a birth. Actually, I think, in the 1940s. Some of you may be that old, I don't know. But in the 1940s, it wasn't until 1940s that science knew that the universe had a beginning. Up until just 70, 80 years ago, 80 some years ago, no one knew that the universe had a beginning. Everyone thought the universe was beginningless until 80 some years ago. Ancient rishis knew Not just that the universe had a beginning, but that it came and went. Just like human lifetimes come and go, the ancient rishis had that powerful intuition that just as human lives come and go, entire universes come and go. So thousands of years ago, the ancient rishis had an insight that modern science figured out only 80 years ago. That's interesting to note. And finally, Sri Krishna says, Aham Dhata. I am the one who established the laws of creation. A good way to understand Dhata. The one who established the laws of creation that allowed the universe to come and go in cycles. The one who established the laws of karma. In fact, the universe comes and goes in cycles due to the laws of karma. Just as human beings are born again and again due to the laws of karma, in the same way the entire universe becomes manifest and then undergoes dissolution, all according to the laws of karma. From whom did those laws of nature come forth, including the laws of karma? Sri Krishna says, I am the Dhata, the one who established the laws of nature and the one who is Vishwato Mukha. What a wonderful Sanskrit expression. The one whose mukha, face, is Vishwataha in all directions. Try to imagine, we have a face on one side of our head. What would it be like to have a face which simultaneously points not in 4 directions, 6, up and down, front, back, left, right, up and down. The one whose face is turned in all 6 directions. What a creative and poetic way of understanding Ishvara. Ishvara doesn't have one. If Ishvara had a face like you and me, Ishvara could turn his head away. Ishvara's face is directed in all directions all the time. Ishvara is Sarvagnya, all-knowing, cannot turn his face away. Wonderful, wonderful poetry. We'll see more in our next class, and we'll have more to enjoy. I'm glad we have some more coming. A couple of important announcements at the end of our class here. This coming Wednesday is Guru Purnima. And since we are a place of learning, Guru Purnima is one of the important celebrations of the year. And so next week, instead of our usual Bhagavad Gita class at 11 o'clock, we will have a celebration of Guru Purnima. Because of the pandemic, we had suspended all of our celebrations. So we are now beginning to reintroduce our celebrations after a long hiatus. So we'll begin with Guru Purnima. We'll begin at 11 o'clock. We'll gather here, and at our Guru altar, I'll do a simple puja. You'll all participate with the chanting. After the Guru puja, I'll give a discourse. I'll share with you some observations important about the symbolism and meaning of Guru Purnima and the role and function of Guru, and the importance of Guru. And then after that, in previous celebrations, we would serve a meal, but maybe because of the ongoing pandemic, it might be best not to meet for a meal. So instead of going downstairs for lunch, as we used to do, what we will do is I will sit out and greet you and give you prasad. We'll all be masked. We still want to be a little cautious with the pandemic, so I will greet you after the event and give you prasad. So next week, please come and join us at 11 o'clock for our Guru Purnima celebration. And the second important announcement is this. For the past year, I've been working on a huge project I may have mentioned before in passing, it is a presentation of the Bhagavad Gita, which is actually a dramatic reenactment with actors who are my students here, and they are reciting the verses of the Bhagavad Gita in a dramatic portrayal of Sri Krishna and Arjuna in a chariot and costume, and I think it's come out really well. It's taken a whole year to produce all 18 chapters, and now the production is finally coming to an end. We will start publishing the Bhagavad Gita one chapter per week, starting with Guru Purnima. So next Wednesday, we'll publish the first chapter. You can go to my YouTube channel to see the video. We'll also publish. If you sign up for our program announcements on our website, then you get an email that'll give you the details so you can watch that. And I'm really, not just because it's a huge project, but it's really come out well. So I'm very happy, and I think you'll enjoy it. It's just a very wonderful way to immerse yourself in the Bhagavad Gita in a very pleasant way, engaging way. So please do watch that video. First chapter will be published next Wednesday on Guru Purnima. And we'll conclude with our brief prayers at the altar. Oh, thank you. Oh, yeah, Vasanti is reminding me to make it clear that even though Guru Purnima is on Wednesday, our celebration is Saturday. So just to make it very clear, please come on Saturday at 11 o'clock, same time. Instead of Bhagavad Gita class, we will celebrate Guru Purnima. Thank you. Om Gananahan Tva Ganapatigum Avamahe Kaving Gavinamukmashravastamam Jeshtarajam Brahmanam Brahmanaspataha Nashrinvan Utabasira Sadhanam Om Mahaganapataye Namaha Ishvaro Gururatmeti Murti Bheda Vibhagine Vyoma Vadvyapta Dehaya Dakshina Murtaye Namaha Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsa Chanuramardanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishnam Vande Jagadgurum Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityor Ma Amritangamaya Om Shanti 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 Om Tat Sat.